We're here to talk history, but probably not in the way you may be expecting. I'd like to take you on a path less traveled. To get started, imagine that you're walking down the street and you notice a man walking on the other side of the street. After a few moments, a second man comes up from behind and taps the first man on the shoulder. The first man turns around, and after a brief interchange, he reaches into his pocket, pulls out his wallet, and hands the second man $100 bill. The two men then walk away in different directions. What's the fact of what you just saw? Well, you saw $100 transfer ownership from the first man to the second. Is that all you need to know? Let's try again, and this time I'm going to add the story so your heart can understand what you just saw. What if I told you the second man was a robber? When the first man turned around, he said, "I've got a gun in my pocket. Hand over all your money or else." Or let's try this. What if I said the two men were actually old friends? The second man was down on his luck and had previously phoned his friend and asked if he could borrow $100, and they had agreed to meet there. Or what if it was the other way around? What if the first man had been the one to borrow the $100, and he had asked his friend to meet him so that he could pay him back? Let's go back to the first robber scenario. What if I told you the first man was a multimillionaire? No, let's say he had been unemployed for several months. No, let's say several years. He had just been to the bank and withdrawn his last $100. He has a little girl at home, and she's sick. In fact, the doctor told him if he didn't get medicine for her right away, she was going to die. He was on his way to get that medicine, and now his money was gone. Isn't it interesting? That same $100 bill yielded greed, joy, sorrow, anguish, gratitude, love, despair, and annoyance. The fact that it was a $100 bill really was the least important piece of information of all. It gave us a point of reference, but that was about it. And notice, if I were to ask you to tell me in words what greed or joy or anguish feels like, could you? The heart understands things that cannot always be expressed in words or directly taught, but still it knows. And as the fox and the little prince so rightly observed, it is only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye. It is this realm of the heart that separates humans from machines, and it's all these feelings that make life worth living. I hope you begin to see the dilemma of the traditional approach to history, where the emphasis is on facts and information, on dates and chronologies. I understand why our schools do it. It's really a practical thing. You can test facts fairly and absolutely. How many men did we see? How much money passed between them? You can create a long list of facts to be learned, assign them a grade level, create a curriculum out of them, test them, check them off the list, and file a report to those who hold you accountable. Parents like the reassurance that their child is on grade level or above grade level, especially if he is scoring better than 97% of his classmates. But it's only the facts that can be measured and tested. You cannot measure a feeling. I believe this reliance on facts and the testing of them is deadening the hearts and starving the souls of our children. For all our testing and concern about reading comprehension, the majority of our students will never pick up another book and read it after graduation. And if by chance they do, I can almost guarantee it will not be a book of history, poetry, or classic literature. The very mention of these words stirs up an intense dislike they've developed for the subjects. For all our testing and concern over proper spelling, grammar, composition, vocabulary, and MLA form, most students will settle into short texts of BRB and LOL. They have little in their hearts they care to write about. Because they have spent 20 years answering someone else's question, by the time they leave school, they have lost the desire and even the ability to ask their own questions. For all our academic worrying, Studies suggest that students will lose 90% of what we force feed them. Because practically every day of their lives has been scheduled and assigned by someone else, with little time to dream, to lie on the grass and watch the clouds go by, they lack self-control and self-motivation. After graduation, they finally enter a world, as someone has said, surrounded by all stirring things, unmoved. They can't tell a birch from an elm, a peony from a primrose. They know nothing of the meaning of the songs of the birds or the stars in the sky. Studies are revealing high levels of depression, hopelessness, anxiety, and dissatisfaction with life and relationships. If something is to be judged by its fruit, this is not good fruit. We need to seriously look for a new path, and that's the search I've been on, and I know many of you are searching as well. I'm going to share what I've been learning, but this is a work in progress. A while back, an elderly gentleman who lived down the road from me passed away, and I went to his estate sale. Evidently, he had been a school teacher, and I came home with some of his textbooks from the 1920s and 30s. I keep this set right next to my desk, Treasury of Life and Literature, Reading and Living in 5 volumes. It's a series of readers for the middle and upper grades. Listen to what's written in the preface. Good books help us to live together. At home or at school, at work or at play, we spend most of our waking hours with other people. Happiness depends largely upon our success in getting along with companions. Indeed, a successful life is chiefly the result of living well with other folk. And then it goes on to say that the selections of literature were chosen to portray life and present ideals of right living. Somewhere between then and now, we separated learning from happy living, didn't we? This path less traveled that I'm going to describe today, and in part 2, is an attempt to join learning and happy living back together. I want to use the study of history as a means of helping our children learn the art of joyful living. We'll use the men and women of history to portray life and present ideals of right living. In the world's economy, the richest person is the one who makes the most money. The graduating class that commands the highest salary is deemed the most successful. But in heaven's economy, the richest person is the one with the greatest capacity for joy, which is closely tied into the person's capacity to love. Both joy and love reside in the heart. The writers of the 1920s text clearly understood the everlasting value of the riches of the heart. I would consider that good fruit, and I want our children to be very, very rich. There are 4 languages that awaken feeling and stir emotions in the heart: music, visual arts or images, poetry, and story. We call these the arts. You even find the word art in the word heart. They are food for the heart. Words and numbers have to be converted or attached to one of these transporters, or they'll pass right through the system without ever entering the heart, which is a great loss because it's the heart where true understanding takes place, as was demonstrated in the story of the 2 men I opened with. The great German writer and statesman Goethe suggested and lived by a lifetime plan for a happy heart. Every day, he said, he listened to a piece of fine music, gazed upon a work of fine art, recited a beautiful poem, and read a piece of fine literature. These became the jewels of his life. Think about the nature of a jewel. It's very, very small, but extremely valuable, sometimes priceless. It's one of the few things in this world that doesn't deteriorate. A diamond is forever, and it sparkles. These jewels of the heart add the sparkle to our lives. Or put another way, as someone has pointed out, earth without art is Most of history's greatest and most useful treasures for life are buried in music, visual arts, poetry, and story. In our facts and testing world, our children never become fluent in the languages of the heart, and the treasures remain unmined. Let's spend a few minutes with each of these languages. Music is pure emotion and travels to a place in our heart where words alone cannot reach. It's the first language our heart understands and the last to go. Those who work with Alzheimer's patients have seen music unlock the store of memories. I've heard music referred to as audible math because it's based on the same laws of the universe by which all things are brought into order. The ordering properties of music make it possible for us to hold on to 26 letters of an alphabet in a specific order. Greek children sang their lessons. Moral truths can be embedded in the heart through the same means. The right music purifies our emotions and changes us at our core. Music is a powerful tool of bringing much joy and meaning into our lives if we are familiar with its language. Beethoven wrote, "He who can enter into the spirit of my music will be beyond the reach of the world's misery." The great masters of music made it possible for us to feel emotions we had never been able to feel before, even seeking to reveal the very glory of God to human hearts. Like Humphrey Bogart said in Casablanca, "A few bars of music are worth a bucketful of words." Visual arts, images, and pictures are the second language of the heart. We say in one ear and out the other, but we don't say in one eye and out the other, because images make deep and long-lasting impressions on the heart. Dr. Rich Melheim said that while the human ear can process 10,000 bits of information per second, the human eye can process up to 7 billion bits of information per second. Therefore, neurologically speaking, a picture is not worth 1,000 words. It's worth 700,000 words. That's why symbolism is such a powerful teaching tool for the heart. The heart can instantly access a whole concept or idea in a single symbol or picture. Great artists hide all kinds of messages for the heart in their paintings, and fine art has the power to awaken a love of beauty, truth, and goodness in children. The third language of the heart is poetry, which combines the ordering properties of music's rhythm with the imagery of words, which also makes its effect long-lasting and deep. Poetry is painting with words. Much of what we know of history before there was written language is that which was preserved in the ballads of music and poetry that were passed down and sung from generation to generation. Although the facts were largely lost over its journey through time, the spirit of the ages was preserved. A poet can capture a truth in a few words that a scholar cannot express in 10,000. Without poetry, we would know little about the ancient days. And when hearts of nations have grown cold, it's the poets who have breathed new life into them. Finally, the fourth language, story, converts words into moving pictures which the heart understands, into which it attaches feeling and holds on to it. Often when a person is trying to explain something and the listener isn't getting it, he'll stop and say, "Let me illustrate that." And he'll tell a story, and then the listener understands. Abraham Lincoln was a master storyteller. He would often sit quietly and listen to the heated debates of his cabinet that were going nowhere. Then he'd offer some seemingly unrelated simple story, and suddenly everyone could see the same thing and they'd find resolution. When you consider that Jesus had just 3 years for his earthly ministry, and that he chose to spend that time telling stories which have influenced the lives of hundreds of millions of people, you begin to get a sense of the power of stories on our hearts. Rudyard Kipling taught, "If history were taught in the form of stories, it would never be forgotten." There is a time for scholarship in the study of history, but childhood is not that time. When a baby is born, his brain is not fully developed. Just as the heart develops before the brain within the womb, emotions develop before intellect outside the womb. By divine design, in large measure, the first 14 to 15 years, and particularly the first 8 years, are reserved for making impressions on the heart, while the heart is open and uncluttered. This developmental order is why the more you use the languages of the heart in childhood, the more your child will comprehend. Hearts tend to harden as we age, and if you use those impressionable years for pure academic study, you may miss a window of opportunity for which it will be hard to compensate for later. However, if you use the heart years to make impressions of the good, the true, and the beautiful, you will have laid a strong foundation for a joyful life. This generation of children has access to jewels and riches no other generation before has had. With this little modern-day miracle, the tablet, our children can listen to the most beautiful music that has ever been composed, performed by the finest musicians around the world on demand. They get front row seats to the Bolshoi Ballet, the Metropolitan Opera, and the New York Philharmonic. They can gaze upon works of fine art hung in palaces, museum corridors, and private estates. The poetry and literature of the most brilliant minds and hearts of the ages can be accessed with the touch of a finger, and all for free. I will repose a question from the past. Will you go and gossip with your housemaid or your stable boy when you may talk with kings and queens, while this eternal court is open to you with its society wide as the world, the chosen, the mighty of every place and time? Royalty and nobility, for all their power and wealth, could scarcely scratch the surface of the education now placed in the hands of the child in the humblest home. Our children truly have the potential of becoming the richest generation the world has ever seen, but not if we keep deadening their hearts and starving their souls. Hungry hearts, finding nothing within for nourishment, turn to outside pleasures. Endless video games, non-stop shopping, excessive eating, alcohol, recreational drugs, pornography, the pleasures of sex without relationship or responsibility, and this obsession with looks. And truly neglected hearts derive a sick pleasure by inflicting pain. They feed on the miseries of others. They are consumers, not producers, and they are never satisfied. Lacking roots in the heart, they bear no fruit. I saw for myself a few summers ago what happens when a plant has a shallow, weak root system. I planted a square-foot garden and was so excited when all the stems started popping up, but then nothing happened. The plants withered and died before they ever bore any fruit. A friend told me that I hadn't given the plants enough water and nutrients so that the plants could grow a rich and deep root structure. Without a strong root system, a plant can never produce fruit, and neither can our children. I am suggesting to you that the reason our current educational system is not producing good fruit is because we are neglecting the roots of our children's hearts. Without a strong root system in the heart, learning withers and dies on the vine before bearing fruit. All our attention is on the academic stems. The academic establishment doesn't even try to hide the fact that it values STEM subjects over root education. But mothers in the home can change that, because no one has the access to the heart of a child that a mother has. Educating hearts of children, growing strong root systems in the heart, is a lost art that this generation of mothers needs to relearn if we want to raise a generation of children who are fluent enough in the languages of the heart to access the treasure so recently delivered to them. The good news is that this same technological wonder that brought us the jewels also delivered the writings of a group of heart specialist educators who lived 100 years ago. I've been immersed in their writings for the last several years, and what I'm now going to share with you are some of the lessons of some of the harvest of ideas that I've gleaned from them. They knew how to grow strong root systems in children's hearts, and I've been trying to wrap my mind around what they're saying and figure out ways to incorporate the ideas, and I hope that you can help. They taught that a child must progress through 3 developmental learning stages, each one serving a specific purpose. To some extent, you can go back and pick up what was missed, but you cannot rush the process going forward, nor would you want to. As I go through this, you'll notice the layering process. Heart-based education is very much a line upon line, layer upon layer, here a little, there a little process, which is very different from acquiring facts and information. The first step is the familiar stage, and in the learning process, you always need to find or create a familiar link to build upon. My kids tease me because I still use AOL and WordPerfect. I know I'm a dinosaur. They tell me there are much better options out there, but I resist them because AOL and WordPerfect are familiar to me, and it's human nature to resist that which is not familiar to us. Little children demand the same story be read to them over and over again because of its familiarity, and babies cling to Mama because she is familiar. A child will resist a subject that has no familiar connections. Attention, desire, interest, and enjoyment all depend upon recognition of familiar qualities. Let me illustrate with a couple of stories, of course. Last December, my daughter's family was learning about George Washington, and she suggested a couple of biographies to her oldest daughter. One was about George, and the other one was about Martha. The books sat unread. Then I took my granddaughter up to Mount Vernon. It was just before Christmas, so there weren't many people around, and we rocked in the rocking chairs on the veranda and watched the boats out on the Potomac, and our hearts knew why Washington loved the place so much. Then our tour guide took us up to the second floor to Washington's bedroom. We saw the very bed he died in. She told us that after he died, Martha was so broken-hearted, she closed the door to the bedroom, locked it, and never went in again. Then the guide took us to the third floor where visitors usually aren't allowed to go, and showed us the little bedroom Martha spent her last few years in. Outside her bedroom was a small round window. The day they buried her husband, the tour guide told us that she sat and looked out that very window because she couldn't bear to go down. As we looked out the window, we could see the vault where his body was originally laid and imagined the sorrowful scene. We did far more feeling than talking. My daughter told me later, without any urging on her part, that after my granddaughter got home, she had both biographies read by the next night, and commented that she wished she had read them before she went to Mount Vernon, and was now anxious to go back. This is the attraction of the familiar. My little 2-year-old grandson has been sick, so he's been a little bit cranky. A couple of nights ago, his daddy went to read him a bedtime story. Do you want to hear the story of Mulan? No. Do you want to hear the story of the mouse and the cookies? No. Do you want to hear the story of the Little Mermaid? No. Do you want to hear the story of the little boy who could only say no? Huh? And he listened attentively while his daddy made up a story of a little boy who could only say no. He had connected to the familiar of the moment. Your wonderful and enjoyable job as a mom is to make as many unfamiliar things familiar to your children as you can, because then you've given them many connecting links for learning to take place. You can familiarize things by naming them, telling stories about them, and bringing your child in contact with them. The first 5 years of a child's life are primarily for familiarizing your child with the immediate world he lives in. A toddler becomes familiar with the world he lives in by touching, tasting, hearing, smelling, and seeing, and the more connections to the real world you give him, the stronger foundation for future learning you are laying. I've always found it interesting to watch how connected to true things children are. I can give a child a bright, neon-colored plastic toy to play with, and his attention lasts about 3 seconds. But if I put him next to mud or grass or water or sand, his attention is held for a very long time. The first language you have to work with is music. Your lullabies to a newborn bring a sense of calm and comfort to his heart. Both the language of words and the language of music are acquired by exposure, so do play beautiful classical music in your home so it will become familiar to him, and sing songs. There is also a music to spoken language. In the beginning, a child isn't listening for the meaning of words, he's listening to the music. One of the reasons preschoolers can effortlessly pick up several languages simultaneously is because they're not encumbered by verb conjugations and tenses. They're listening to the music of the language and mimicking it. The reason that reading aloud to your children is so important is because the music in your voice adds a layer of meaning that their hearts understand. For example, let's take this little 2-letter word, O. It's not a difficult word to read, but listen as the music in my voice gives 4 different meanings to the word that only your heart can decipher. Oh, 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 oh. Much of the deepest meaning of great literature is found in the music of the words, and so you want to familiarize your little ones with beautiful language. There are few books in the English language that do this as perfectly as the King James Version of the Bible. Scholars tell us this was written at the peak of the English language. It's full of poetry, imagery, and story. Feel the difference between these 2 passages of Scripture. The first one is from the King James Version. And straightway, coming out of the water, he saw the heavens opened, and the Spirit like a dove descending upon him. And there came a voice from the heavens, saying, Thou art my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Now listen to a modern version. As he was climbing up the bank again, the sun shone through a gap in the clouds. At the same time, a pigeon flew down and perched on him. Jesus took this as a sign that God's Spirit was with him. A voice from overhead was heard saying, That's my boy. You're doing fine. Could you feel the difference? When you read scriptural language to little children, they're understanding it at a different level than you. I've found little children are drawn to scriptural language. My personal opinion is they're hearing a familiar language carried with them that has not yet been completely forgotten. Its familiarity is a heavenly music. Much of the meaning of literature they'll read later will come from the music of the words. Familiarizing them with beautiful language lays the groundwork. It's the music of words that makes Mother Goose so delightful to children. The words are mostly nonsense. That's not what they're listening for. You may not think it, but by giving your 1-year-old Mother Goose, you're preparing him to one day love Homer. And that's not as in Homer Simpson, it's the other Homer. And rhyme begins to bring order to your baby's brain. As you continue up this developmental ladder and begin to introduce your little ones to art, poetry, and story, you want to apply these familiar principles to the subjects you choose. What's more familiar to a little child than family and home, nature, and animals? I think it's worth paying attention to the fact that the Old Testament opens with a story of a family in a garden, and the New Testament begins with a story of a family in a stable surrounded by animals. Familiar and family have the same root words, and you'll want to make all things family familiar to your little ones in these first 5 years. I'll also mention here, there is a heart-based way to learn science too, and stories of nature begin to grow the root system for that. The next language is pictures or images. Why do toddlers love picture books? Because they speak to their hearts. It's a language their hearts understand. You can help them acquire a taste for beautiful fine art by exposing and familiarizing them with it when they're young and allowing it to speak to their hearts. I was sitting behind a little 2-year-old girl on her daddy's lap at church and was watching her stare intently at a little book of fine art prints her mom had created for her. The pictures depicted Jesus' life, and she had glued them on bright colored paper and put them in a little photo album that was just the right size for her little girl's hands. She stared at each picture for the longest time, and I knew the pictures were speaking directly to her heart. And I thought, well, you could do the same thing with fine art images of mommies and babies and kittens that are familiar at this age. I picked up this photo album for about 97 cents at Walmart. It's just the right size for little hands, and I just printed out copies of fine art prints and glued them onto colored paper and put them in this little photo album. A mother in our group just posted this picture, and she printed out some fine art prints of mothers and babies and kittens and put them in a notebook, and you can see how it has drawn the attention of her little ones. Learning by heart is a lot like eating cake. Estelle Hurl, an art educator from 100 years ago, wrote, "If you are giving a child a piece of cake, it adds nothing to his enjoyment to tell him that it contains certain ingredients and was made by certain rules, or that it will contribute to his nourishment. If it is good, he eats it and wants more." I gave my daughter this little picture book about how all the farmyard animals go to sleep at night time. She called me one night and said, "Thanks a lot for the book." Her little 18-month-old had just made her read it to her 17 times in a row. She finally got her to go outside to play with her sisters, and my daughter hid the book in the bottom of a big pile of books. As soon as her little girl came back in the house, she dug through the pile of books until she found it again and made her mom read it again. We were trying to figure out why the fixation, and then it dawned on us. We had just spent a week in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in Amish country. Her little girl had been petting baby lambs and little ponies and watching the sunsets over barns and farms. We think this book recreated all those feelings that were still so fresh and familiar to her, and she wanted to keep reliving them. Again, the attraction of the familiar. Familiarity gives pleasure. By age 3, children are ready for stories. Look for stories with that familiar family element. The story of a mama bear, papa bear, and little baby bear. Stories of how mommy birds and mommy squirrels take care of their babies. Story of when daddy was a little boy. Simple stories of family life. Playtime allows them to process what they're learning as they pretend being mommies and daddies and taking care of little babies. When they pick up a crayon and start to draw circles and squiggly lines, don't be too quick to say, "Oh, look what you can do. You can draw a letter A." There is nothing in the letter A that is familiar or appealing to a 3-year-old. They want to draw sunshines and flowers, kittens and mommies, all with smiley faces. Let them improve their manual dexterity by drawing pictures, not letters. Once the heart sees a use for letters, writing will happen easily. No need to rush it. By age 4, they're transitioning into the imaginative years, and they love to hear stories of familiar things in imaginative ways, like Raggedy Ann, a doll who comes to life, or Peter Cottontail. And the more they listen to stories they love, stories that make them feel something, their little hearts send a message to their brains. "Brain, Mom doesn't have enough time to feed us as many stories as we want down here. I need you to learn how to read so I can get up more stories." And the brain gets to work. I've met many people who were raised in story-rich environments who had no recollection of being taught how to read. It happened as naturally as acquiring speech, and I've seen research that backs that up. Now we enter the prime years for imagination, starting at around age 5, when the heart longs to see familiar things from new angles. And the imagination makes it possible by creating its own images of things the eyes have actually never seen before. Don't rush or slight these years. This is the stuff upon which dreams are built, and as Laboulaye cautions, mothers who love your children, do not set them too soon to the study of history. Let them dream while they are young. There are many reasons for cultivating imaginations. For instance, creativity is dependent upon imagination. Nothing in this world has ever been created that didn't first exist as an image in someone's mind. And Felix Adler wrote, "Much of the selfishness of the world is not due to actual hard-heartedness, but to a lack of imaginative power, the faculty of putting oneself in the place of others." Plus, a vivid imagination is crucial in the study of history. Because it is impossible to reproduce history except through the imagination. Fairy tales and simple stories from mythology are the perfect foods for feeding the imagination. As your children listen to fairy tales, they are not only expanding their capacity to create pictures and images in their minds, their young, impressionable hearts are processing right and wrong, good and evil, justice and injustice in a way that could never be taught directly. They're going to need that as they start applying these lessons to the stories of history. As you tell them fairy tales and folk tales from around the world, you are also providing a layer of familiarity to names and cultures from other lands. A young child loves the music of names like Aphrodite, Prometheus, and Eurydice. They're difficult words to read, but when the music of their names is familiar, they'll be like old friends when they start reading them. And there is one more important benefit of introducing these fairy tales and myths. These imaginative stories can connect your child's heart to the hearts and spirit of the families of historic times, because the stories flowed out of their hearts and were passed from generation to generation down to your child. As you start to share these stories, you'll want to help your children begin to pay attention to those things that strike their heart and help them hold on to them. For little children, it can be as simple as this. After my daughter read The Frog Prince to her little girl, she said, "I like that story. I want to remember it." So she sat down and drew this picture, and she wrote the gem from the story, "A promise is a promise." Her little 6-year-old said, "I want to do that." And her 10-year-old said, "I want to do that." And they did. I love these bear books, and there are so many ways you can use them to help your children start being mindful of what they love and what they want to remember. These durable hardcover blank books are very inexpensive. Most of them are less than $2. Instead of a bunch of papers that get thrown away, these books can become keepsakes and treasures. You can take a little book like one of these and write Emma's favorite stories on the cover. And then as you tell stories from time to time, let them draw a picture just like the Frog Prince that instantly reminds them of the stories they love. And then sometime when you're sitting on the couch, say, "Hey, Emma, where's your favorite stories book?" And as you look through it with her, ask, "Now, how did that story go again?" Verbal expression precedes written expression, and this gives a fun place to start. Don't turn it into an assignment. Force will take all the fun out of it and stop the learning process. Force is the enemy of learning by heart. A 6-year-old who is familiar with beautiful language and can create pictures in his head will love to have you read the wonderful children's classics aloud to him, like Secret Garden, Treasure Island, and Heidi. A child's listening comprehension at this age far exceeds his reading comprehension, so you can offer impressions to his heart that he couldn't yet get on his own. Even if he's a good reader, freeing him up to feel the music in your voice and create all the pictures in his heart without being bogged down in the mechanics of reading will make for long-lasting impressions. A Literature Gems notebook is the next step up from the My Favorite Stories book I just described and works well when you start reading these longer classics. While you're reading along and you come to something that touches your heart, take a little post-it note and mark it. I really love that. Afterwards, go back and look at the pages you marked. If it's something that you really want to hold on to, ask yourself if it's something you really want to hold on to or if you want to find it again. If the answer is yes, then it's time to create a page for your Literature Gems book. Here's a page from my book. I put the title at the top, the author, when she wrote it, where and when the story took place, and then basically I'm scrapbooking wisdom that I'm gleaning from the literature I read. For instance, I copied, "Perhaps to be able to learn things quickly isn't everything. To be kind is worth a great deal to other people." If there are illustrations, I glue them on the page. Remember, a picture is worth 700,000 words to help me remember the story. Then I place the page alphabetically by title in a notebook. If your child's been watching you, at some point she will likely say, "I want to do that." In the beginning, her pages may only have pictures. That's okay. And maybe she wants to draw them herself, and that's okay too. Sometimes I have moms say, I don't know what I'm supposed to put on the notebook pages. To which I respond, if there's nothing to which your heart has yet said, I love that, I want to remember that, then there is no point in making a notebook. But once the heart has found something it loves, copying it will drive the impression deeper and make it last longer. And some of our greatest writers have said that's how they learned to write, by copying the writings of other great writers. They learned secrets of great writing that could not be taught directly because it's transferred heart to heart, and heart work is always done underground where it can't be seen. Here's a sample of a Literature Gems page without pictures. I just dressed it up with splashes of color. By age 7, you can start familiarizing your children with some of the great names of history by telling them stories of their childhoods, which provides the link of familiarity. They all also like to hear stories of what it looked like to be a child living in a faraway land. These stories begin to make impressions of different cultures that is preparatory work to the study of nations that lies ahead. And around this time, the heart says to the brain, Brain, I have stories in here that I want to remember. I need you to get working on and figuring out all that writing and spelling stuff so that I can write them down. And the brain says, but I don't know how to do that. And the heart says, well, maybe you just better go ask Mom. And the brain gets to work. Around the age of 8, the child is now prepared and ready to enter the heroic years. He has strong imaging capabilities. He has the beginnings of discernment between right and wrong. He has lots of familiar connection points. He's at home with stories, and he now quite naturally wants to hear about real people. At no other time in life will heroes make a deeper impression on the heart than between the ages of 8 to around 11. He wants his first heroes to be action heroes, which make introductory stories to the great epic and legendary heroes a perfect choice. They provide a bridge between the imaginative years and the heroic years because they're partly grounded in fiction and partly in fact. These are the stories of King Arthur and Robin Hood, Roland and Siegfried, Beowulf and Hiawatha. By age 9, children are interested in short, picturesque stories of the great men and women of history. This is the Plutarch approach to history, which looks nothing like the school approach of facts and information. When Plutarch wrote his lives of great Greeks and Romans, he admitted that already the facts of their lives had been obscured. That didn't concern him, and he covered himself by using a simple device. And so the story goes. And he wrote, by lodging these men one after the other in my house, I may see how to adjust and adorn my own life. Through daily living and associating with them, I perceive all their qualities and select all those that are noblest and worthiest. And his Bible for Heroes is one of the most influential books of all time. Help your children to start doing the same thing, to judge, to lodge the great men and women of history one after another in your home so that they can see how to adjust and adorn their own lives. Nothing is more interesting to us than life. Stories of people are what children's hearts are interested in, and while how we dress and what we eat may have changed throughout history, human nature has not. The ancient Greek has as much to teach your child's heart as the knight in shining armor. Children care little for the dates and facts of history. Long ago is far more meaningful at this age than 600 BC. You can pique their interest in historical stories by looking for familiar elements. Does your child own a dog? Well, here's a good story. Did you ever hear the story of Newton and his little dog Diamond? One day when Newton was 50 years old and had been hard at work more than 20 years studying the theory of light, he went out of his room, leaving his little dog asleep before the fire. On the table lay a heap of papers containing all the discoveries which Newton had made during those 20 years. When his master was gone, up rose little Diamond, jumped upon the table, and overthrew the lighted candle. The papers immediately caught fire. Just as the destruction was completed, Newton opened the door and saw that the labors of 20 years were reduced to a heap of ashes. There stood little Diamond, the author of all mischief. Almost any other man would have flown into a rage, some even hurting their little dog. But Newton patted him on the head with his usual kindness, although grief was in his heart. "Oh, Diamond, Diamond," said he, "thou little knowest the mischief thou hast done." This incident affected his health and spirits for some time afterwards, but from the way he treated his little dog, you may judge what was the sweetness of his personality. If you can find an illustration, paste it on a page like I did for Sir Isaac Newton. Or a child can illustrate it. They're now ready to start a new notebook. While the Literature Gems notebooks give me a place to continue scrapbooking wisdom from the imaginary world, the Story of the World notebook gives me a place to scrapbook wisdom from real people. Show your children how to create pages for the men and women they'll be making friends with as they lodge them in their home one at a time, by doing it yourself for your own notebook. In the beginning, this picture may be the only thing on the page. It speaks volumes even by itself. I write the name of the person at the top of the page. Then I pull my phone out. "Siri, when was Isaac Newton born?" And I write the year in the top corner. "When did he die?" I write that underneath. "Where did he live?" And I write that underneath. I have now created a landing page, which means any time I bump into Isaac Newton and find something that he has said or a story about his life that my heart wants to remember, I have a place for that to land where I can find it again. Here's a quote I found later and added. "I seem to myself like a child playing on the seashore and picking up here and there a curious shell or a pretty pebble, while the boundless ocean of truth lies undiscovered before me." My heart likes that. I'm not loading the page with facts because I can get any fact I want instantly from my phone. But my phone cannot provide food for my heart. There was a time when it was important to memorize facts because they weren't easy to access. We're living in a new age where we can devote our time to weightier matters. And you may recognize in this process of creating landing pages that you are preparing your students for research, where they gather materials together from many different sources into one place. I even create landing pages for my ancestors and place them in this story of the world. Here's my Grandma Johnson's page. She grew up in Sweden, but moved to America after falling in love with a potato farmer from Idaho. Life was very hard for her in a new country, but my mother said she was very patient. When crops failed, she never despaired. She'd just say, "Next time will be better." That's the gem I wanted to remember. And when I read a story about Sweden, I feel like that's my country. Those are my family members in that history, and I have a personal interest in it. Historical fiction can increase familiarity with these men and women they're getting to know and familiarize the places and times in which they lived. As your children's reading skills improve, they'll do more independent reading to keep up with a desire to learn more. By age 10 or 11, their hearts don't need to be fed as much with make-believe, and they want history delivered more directly. The Landmark series from the 50s and 60s is an example of a good read for that age, and they'll continue to meet new people through biographies and stories. You can use fine art to bring stories of history to life and deepen impressions like this. In the proud days when Rome ruled the world and the emperor lived in a palace of white marble or in a house of pure gold, the Colosseum was the greatest theater ever known to be set up on the earth. There to this day it stands, shattered and broken, but still perhaps the most impressive ruin in all the world. In its dark and shameful days, the great white Colosseum, rising story after story from the ground, with great galleries inside to hold 40,000 people, was a wondrous sight to see. Here came the gladiators, strong men trained to fight each other until one of them was killed. Here the Christians were thrown alive to the lions to make a Roman holiday. No place in the world has seen more cruel sights than this. But slowly Christianity made its way until the very emperor became a Christian. Then these shameful things ceased, and the Colosseum became only a circus. The Christians had been growing stronger and stronger for 400 years, when there came a terrible day for Rome. Alaric, leader of the Goths, came thundering outside Rome, but a brave general set the Goths to flight. Such rejoicing there was in Rome that day that the people flocked to the Colosseum, cheering their brave general. There was a wonderful performance when suddenly came out of one of the narrow passages leading into the arena a gladiator with spears and swords. The rejoicing of the people knew no bounds. Then happened a strange thing. Into the middle of the arena came an old man, bareheaded and barefooted, calling upon the people to prevent the shedding of blood. The crowd shrieked back at him to stop his preaching and to go away. The gladiators came forward and forced him aside, but still the old man came between them. A storm of stones fell upon him from the angry people. The gladiator struck him down, and the old man perished before the eyes of Rome. He was a hermit named Telemachus, one of those holy men who, tired of the wickedness of the world, had gone to live in the hills. Coming to Rome to visit the sacred shrines, he had seen the people flocking to the Colosseum, and, pitying them for their cruelty, had gone to stop it or to die. He died, but his work was done. All that was best in Rome was stirred by the sight of the hermit slain in the midst of the arena. And there was no more slaughter in the great theater. It was the last fight in the Colosseum. I started a landing page by gluing the pictures on the page. When I look at these pictures, my heart starts carrying on a conversation within itself like this. Can you imagine a people who are entertained by watching others being tortured and murdered? Well, take a look at the kind of movies people are flocking to these days. But what can I do about it? What can one person do, my heart asks. And then it reminds me of Telemachus, one man of virtue making a stand. And then my heart stops talking and leaves me to ponder. Now I place the page in chronological order in my notebook by year of birth. I couldn't find a birth year for Telemachus, but I found a death year, and that works. As I flip through the pages already in my notebook, trying to find where to fit Telemachus's page in, I notice, Telemachus lived around the same time that St. Patrick was teaching pagans in Ireland. Muhammad was in Arabia, and King Arthur was about to arrive on the scene. My heart makes note of that. By age 12 or 13, a student is ready to start putting the pieces together. Find introductory stories of France, of Greece, of Germany, one nation at a time, so that his heart can begin to get a sense of the sweep of history and can begin to pick up patterns, because the heart is always looking for patterns. He'll also be able to start fitting familiar names into their proper place in history. A student who has no understanding of the history of nations will be clueless as to what's going on in the world today. It's like walking into the movie 2 hours late, where you have no idea what's going on because you missed out on everything that happened before. As our world shrinks, our children need to be very aware of the underlying causes of world conflicts. By age 14, the student's heart may have found topics that it wants to understand at a deeper level, and he may choose to study a thread of art or music, architecture, religion, or science through these nations. By age 15, because he's comfortable with words and imagery and has a rich cultural background, He will gain much from the great works of classical literature like Les Miserables and Tale of Two Cities that will further deepen his understanding of historical events, and from which he will continue to underline and extract gems of wisdom for his literature notebook. By age 16, his heart hungry for deeper understanding, he may tackle books like Durant's Story of Civilization or other works of history. There are so many gaps to fill. He'll continue to read Dickens, Tolstoy, Austen, and is well prepared to enter the ongoing conversation of the world's greats. This is not the end of his learning. This is only the beginning. John Sr., who wrote The End of Christian Culture, said, "In order to read the great books of Plato, Aristotle, St. Augustine, and St. Thomas, we need to replenish the cultural soil that has been depleted and create a place where those works can thrive by cultivating an imaginative ground saturated with fable, fairy tale, stories, rhyme, and adventure, the 1,000 books of Grimm, Anderson, Stevenson, Dickens, Scott, Dumas, and the rest. This you will have done. The one thing a great book's education will not do is create a moral imagination where there is none." And now maybe your child has gone off to college and he's away from home for the first time and he's homesick. His heart reminds him of a story he heard in childhood told by an ancient Greek, Homer, a story of the longing for home. And now, because he's very comfortable in the music of poetry and imagery, his heart wants to feel the story at a deeper level, and so it pulls the story out in its poetic form. And when he's done, maybe his heart will say, "Ah, I really love that. But, brain, we want to feel it on a deeper level. We need you to learn us some Greek." And the brain, ever the obedient servant, says, "I'll get right on it." It's amazing how quickly and efficiently the brain learns hard things when the heart is in the driver's seat, and how slow and painful and inefficient the process is when the heart is nowhere to be found. As I have lodged the great men and women one at a time in my home, this progression of learning, the familiar to the imaginative to the heroic, is the pattern of learning I see in their lives. I see childhoods rich in story and experience, vivid imaginations, and hearts that are always hungry to go deeper as they apply what they are learning to their own lives. As I have gone back, even with my older brain, and replenished the cultural soil of my own heart by reading more fairy tales, reciting more poetry aloud, listening to more classical music, and looking at beautiful works of art, and picking up works of great literature, especially the children's classics, my life has been enriched tremendously. When I see a sunset, I am sitting on the hillside beside the great French painter Millet, and I hear his father whisper in my ear too, "Son, that is God." When I see the daffodils, Wordsworth reminds me I can carry their beauty in my heart always, and my capacity for joy grows larger every day. As to the formal study of history, I remember reading a well-respected historical scholar's opinion that a student isn't really ready for a true study of history until he's 26. I just finished an article where a neuroscientist explained how a brain isn't fully developed until around age 24. Why do teenagers do stupid things? He said it's because the brain is not yet connected to where he can clearly see the consequences of his own actions. Yet we expect that same teenager to analyze political and economic policies and their effects on historical events. The best he can do is parrot back what he hears. He's not yet ready to make such judgments. There are better ways to use his time. We often make the study of history so dry and distasteful that our children put aside their history books long before the age of 26, when they actually can begin a true study of history, which has enough interesting topics to fill a lifetime. As Marguerite Dixon wrote 100 years ago, a taste for historical reading is, after all, the valuable gift we can bestow upon our youthful student of history. Having given him that, we may safely leave the rest to him. I also often hear moms and educators say that they'll only give their students original source documents because they want to be sure they have only the facts. I believe that's a flawed approach. How is it that two highly trained scholars can read the identical source document of Christopher Columbus, and one will conclude Columbus is one of the most despicable men on the planet, and the other will conclude he's one of the bravest and noblest? The answer is, we all filter what we read through our own hearts, and only a well-seasoned and mature heart can make proper judgments of history. That only comes with age and experience. But you may say, this is the 21st century. I need to get my child ready for college and a good career. I don't have time for all these fluffy things. Well, let me throw out a few facts. First of all, the root years are primarily the first 14 years. There's still time for those academic STEM subjects they need to master for college admission exams, and they'll be better prepared and motivated to tackle them. And plus, jewels really don't take up a lot of room. But more importantly, recently, Harvard and 90 other universities so far have announced that they're rethinking their admission policies. They're finding way too many academic overachievers arriving on campus with severe depression, anxiety, hopelessness, and a high level of substance abuse. So they're going to start placing more emphasis on evidence of kindness, on service, on humanity. Tend your child's heart, and you'll actually be giving him an edge on the competition. Furthermore, employers are complaining that while their inbox is loaded with resumes of highly skilled engineers, they're looking for engineers with personality, and those are in shorter supply. Many employers aren't as concerned with specific job skills because they require on-the-job training anyway. What they are looking for are applicants who will show up, who are honest and loyal, who do an honest day's labor for an honest day pay, who get along well with others, who can think creatively and out of the box, who are self-motivated and pleasant. I want a doctor who is compassionate. I want more statesmen and less politicians. I want a boss who sees me as a human being, who gets more excited for the home he's helping me to build than the house he's building for himself on the back of my labor. These all fall in the realm of a well-educated heart. This is my simple observation to you who are focused on college and career. Tend the hearts of your children, and they will be rich on any income. Neglect their hearts, and they will be poor, no matter how much money they make. Today, I've covered the roots, the understanding of why we're doing what we're doing. I hope I didn't overwhelm you. You may be saying, I can't possibly manage all that. But if you'll stop and take time to listen to part 2, I'll turn to the stems, and I'll give you practical ideas for implementing this and give you lots of free tools to work with. It's really not nearly as complicated as it may now appear. We'll put some order to it. In the meantime, I'd like to leave you with this little conversation between the Scarecrow and Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz to think about. Tin Man: Why didn't you walk around the hole? Scarecrow: I don't know enough. My head is stuffed with straw, you know, and that is why I'm going to Oz to ask him for some brains. Tin Man: Oh, I see. But after all, brains are not the best things in the world. Scarecrow: Have you any? Tin Man: No, my head's quite empty, but I once had brains and a heart also. So, having tried them both, I should much rather have a heart. Scarecrow: And why is that? Tin Man: I will tell you a story, and then you will know. He then goes on to tell the story, and ends with, brains do not make one happy, and happiness is the best thing in the world.